Now there's all kinds of different people in this world. There's only one pie.
Welcome to the Teammate Apart podcast, the podcast designed to teach freelancers, contractors, and remote workers, really anyone working apart, how to build better relationships with those they work with and those they work for. I'm your host, Ryan Rogar. Before we get started, financial support for the Teammate Apart podcast Season 2 is provided by R2, a fully distributed brand relationship consultancy. R2 has specific expertise and experience in helping service companies grow, develop, and maintain impactful relationships through world-class brand strategy and design. R2 supports the world's best distributed companies by providing valuable insights, strategy, empathy, and tactical expertise to help them foster truly meaningful relationships from top management to top consumer. If the success of your business depends on the relationships you make, then you need R2. To learn more or to request a call, simply visit r2mg.com/podcast. That's r2mg.com/podcast. R2, relationships squared. Also, financial support comes from teammateapart.com. Leveraging 20 plus years of global agency and creative hiring expertise, Teammate Apart provides distributed organizations with access to the best and brightest creative talent from around the world. Through deep understanding of client needs and meaningful relationships with talent, Teammate Apart facilitates a sort of virtual handshake between prospective employer and prospective employee to reduce risk and eliminate doubt from creative hiring decisions. Take a step towards filling that creative-shaped void in your distributed team by visiting teammateapart.com/talent. That's teammateapart.com/talent to learn more. Finally, financial support comes from supporters like you. Members of our Happy Little Podcast community can make contributions directly to the show by visiting teammateapart.com/podcast and clicking on the donation link. Donations can be in any amount and go a long way towards keeping this show on the air. If you appreciate the work we're doing and would like to get involved, just visit teammateapart.com/podcast, click the donate button, and you're on your way. Thank you for your continued support. And now, on to the show. Hey there, and welcome back to the Teammate Apart podcast. Today's special guest is remote work expert and industry staple, Lisette Sutherland. Lisette is a facilitator, author, speaker, and remote working champion for individuals, teams, and managers. She is the founder of Collaboration Superpowers, a remote work consultancy who bridges the gaps between people and companies, and the author of the best-selling book, Work Together Anywhere. Lisette was kind enough to have featured me on the Collaboration Superpowers podcast back on episode number 254, and here allowing me to return the favor with an amazing discussion about the impact of COVID-19 on remote business, setting intentions, adaptability and resilience, and the future of work. Please join me in welcoming to the show the incredible Lisette Sutherland. Hi, Lisette. Welcome to the show. How are you?
Tired, probably like everybody right now in COVID days. There's sort of an like a virus exhaustion, I think, of just constantly having to be on your toes. But I'm tired and very grateful that I myself am in a luxurious position compared to many people. You know, I work from my home office. I have a big house with no children, so I really can't complain. I shouldn't have started with tired, I guess.
No, I think it's okay. I think it's kind of this resounding feeling that like kind of everybody's working through right now is just this. I mean, I think it's just the stress of having sort of this barrage of just uncertainty happening to us kind of all, for all this time. I mean, it's been months and months at this point. And I think it's, it wears on a person, I think. I think generally speaking, people are starting to come out of it and they're doing okay. But, it's exhausting. I find I'm dead by the end of the evenings.
Yeah, and I'm hearing from a lot of companies right now that, which in a good way, that they're focusing on well-being and mental health for employees right now. Because I just think, I'm hearing it everywhere. People are like, oh, my company, people aren't producing as much. Everybody seems down. And I would keep saying like, yes, and don't make them produce so much right now. Like now is not the time to push. Like now is the time to let people have some time to regroup and rest themselves, because there's a lot on everybody's plate right now.
Yeah,
I was talking to a neighbor. Oh, sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
I was talking to a neighbor yesterday, and she was telling me her situation. She's got 2 children and herself, and she has to work, and her kids have to go to school virtually, and they're all sharing one laptop.
Oh,
and
wow.
I thought, oh man, I can't even imagine sharing my laptop. So Yeah, I can understand people are tired.
Yeah, it's crazy. Well, and just speaking of that, I mean, as we're taping this, the show will air a little bit later, but as we're taping this, my kids are about to start back to school next week. And, they're going to be working at least half time from home. They're going to school 1 or 2 days a week, but the rest of the time they'll be working remotely from home. And then my wife, who is a junior high teacher, is going back to school too. She actually started back yesterday. So she's in there preparing and getting ready for what's sure to be kind of a crazy year. So maybe though, before we get into this, because obviously we're segueing into a great topic, I think let's get a little bit of introductory stuff. So I came to know you by way of introduction and reputation and all this stuff, and I also had the pleasure of doing your podcast, the Collaboration Superpowers podcast, which I was very grateful to be part of. And I really enjoyed those conversations that we had, and I've really appreciated getting to know you. But I wondered if you wouldn't sort of introduce yourself to the audience and just let people know who you are and what you do.
Okay, so I run a company called Collaboration Superpowers, and the whole mission of the company is to help people work better together remotely. We do that through workshops mainly, but there's also lots of free resources available, of course, over time. So there's a whole, just about any topic. We've been doing this for 6 years. For 6 years now. So there's a lot of resources available on the website. So we've been doing that. And I think the thing that really excites me personally about remote work is the idea that we can solve complex problems with people all over the world. And I've always thought this since I was in my 20s. I heard this radio interview of a Stanford professor saying he was trying to do a more well-rounded degree and saying like, okay, you can be an archaeologist, but you also need to know about these science things and these weather things. You have to know sort of the whole thing. So he was trying to go for more of a multifaceted degree where you would just get a little bit of everything, because he said it takes a little bit of every person's knowledge in order to solve big complex problems. And often those people are not in the same room. So what really excites me is just being able to, like, if we get the right people together, we could do global warming, we could cure cancer, we could hopefully cure COVID, if we just get the right people working together. And I think that's the incredible power of it. On top of that, the freedom that it gives individuals to design their own lifestyle. I mean, once you get a taste, it's really hard to go back to any sort of confined working, regardless of what that confinement might be.
Yeah, no, it's so true. And I mean, that's obviously my history too. I mean, I started working remotely as a freelancer, working evenings at night, doing design work for clients over the internet while I was working full time during the day, and eventually was laid off and was given the nudge I needed to kind of go remote full time. And have basically been doing it 20 years at this point. And that was exactly it, right? This ability to craft a lifestyle, I think, is so critical. And it's funny how it's sort of in line with what sort of the attitudes of people, of sort of this present generation are. They're very interested in being able to craft their lifestyle and maybe not do it the way that their parents or maybe grandparents did. So,
right.
So I think it offers a lot of unique opportunities in that respect.
Yeah, the world of work is evolving quickly. Gone are the days from working in factories, not completely. I mean, those jobs are still there and needed. So it's not necessarily for everybody, but gone are the days of total confinement, and here the days are of choice. Yeah. And I always think I want to make it really clear that I'm definitely not here to argue like, oh, remote is great, everybody needs to be remote. What I really like is the choice. Some people want to be remote. Some people, like my husband, hates working from home, hates it. When COVID hit, he was so miserable he has his own office. He just hates it. So I really like the idea that everybody gets to choose to work where they're most productive. And I think the future of work isn't remote. The future of work is choice.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I actually think that that's a sentiment that, you're hearing more and more now. I think there is sort of this stereotype running around, especially among sort of like remote work advocates or people who are writing, many articles about remote work, that it sometimes comes off that what they mean is, remote is the way, everyone must be remote. Like, well, I'll be working from home. And I think one thing that's become exceptionally apparent right now during COVID, especially, is not everybody's cracked up for it and not everybody's actually looking for it. I think there are a lot of people right now with a toe back in the office who've been sort of unable to fully commit to working remote. And for all intents and purposes, don't really care to. They're actually dying to get back to work. And I think that there's nothing wrong with that. So I really like your sentiment, this idea of choice versus, some sort of forced thing. And
absolutely.
Yeah. And especially right now during COVID, this is one observation we've been making recently, is that there's sort of now two classes of remote workers, right? There's people who work remotely by choice, then people who were sort of forced into it by nature of COVID or whatever their situation might have been. And so, and what we're finding is that people who have that toe back in the office, who maybe aren't fully in, they're not investing in all the things they ought to be investing in to become a great remote worker. And as a result, the experience isn't going very well. And we're seeing that even too among employers, for example, who are just, we're certain we're going back to the office. So they haven't totally bought in on remote work. And so as policy goes, or the way they're managing their people go, they're still sort of treating it as if they're in one co-located environment, when the reality is they've actually got to start handling things a little bit differently, or at least, I guess, adapt a little bit.
Well, yeah, because it doesn't look like the lockdowns are going to end anytime soon at this point. We just heard from the Dutch government. I'm living in the Netherlands right now, but we heard from the Dutch government last night that they're encouraging people to work from home at least until January at this point. So, I mean,
and that's the thing. I think with the pandemic, there's some trepidation that there could be, some sort of flare up or something in the winter. And so I think that sort of is going to be the policy. I mean, it's also here in the States, that's sort of the policy. I mean, we have there's a lot of interest, and I think a lot of just an American personality that a lot of us are trying to get back to work and get back to our office or get back to whatever normal is. But I think ultimately, like, the government stance and everything will sort of be that as well. You do, if you can work remote, keep yourself distant, do that sort of thing. And honestly, it's probably not bad to be that responsible for other people.
Yeah. And yeah, I would agree.
Well, so let's transition then into a little bit of maybe a more focused discussion then on this future of work. This is one of the things that it keeps coming up, and I'm actually really excited to talk to you about it, because I think you and I probably have some similar perspectives on the matter. One of the things that's coming up, I've done a lot of interviews on what is the future of work and all this stuff, and I keep going back to this idea that maybe the future of work just kind of is work. Like, it's not really, there's no future of. Like, we don't have some metric in our back pocket that we can look at and go, okay, well, now we've arrived at future of work. And so I think it's really important to sort of look at the world in sort of this fluidity, or appreciate sort of the fluidity of life, and understand that, yes, of course, right now we're all pointing at COVID. This is the big pandemic du jour. This is the reason everybody's doing whatever we're doing. But I mean, ultimately, it's somebody's COVID every day, whatever it is, whether they're experiencing loss, or maybe they've lost a job, or they've lost a loved one, or maybe there's some other situation going on in their life that's causing some stress. I mean, just because now it's COVID and this is something globally we can all relate to, doesn't mean that people don't have these experiences all the time. So I think this idea that we're looking for some dramatic switch or a black and white thing where one day we're going to wake up and it's the future of work, I think is maybe a little naive. So what are your thoughts about sort of where we're going and what's going on in sort of the future of work?
It's a really big question. I mean, right now, so I would say that, in the beginning, people have been struggling just with going remote, like just the logistics of going remote. And like you said, some companies are more prepared for it than others. Some people are planning to go back to the office as soon as possible, so they're not setting the people up remotely. So there's still a bit of struggle there. But for the people that have gotten it, I think the focus has now turned, at least what I'm seeing from the inquiries that I'm getting, is the focus has turned from how do we work remote to how do we make this sustainable for the mental health of our workers. And it's kind of a surprising turn, but what it has laid bare for me is to see how difficult almost everybody finds it to put boundaries on themselves and their time when work and life happen in the same place. That seems to be, because people just say, like, I just keep working. So, which I find very interesting, because, in the past, managers were very reluctant to let people work remotely because they thought people would be lazy. And I always said the opposite was true, but now I think we've proven the opposite is true. So I think the question now is becoming, how do we maintain more work-life balance, more separation, and get enough rest as knowledge workers or as remote workers? So that's sort of where I'm seeing, and from there, I mean, I don't know where this is going to go, but that's sort of where I'm seeing the movement right now.
Well, no, I think that's a great point, and I even point at sort of our experience, sort of at the end of the last school year. I kept making these jokes that, the biggest problem for me during COVID was the introduction of all my new coworkers, because I was used to working from home, and now all of a sudden my family's here and my wife's teaching school remotely, and the boys are here doing school remotely. And now we're about to go back into it. And, I really sort of sat back and thought about what was going on. And my wife was taking emails until 1 a.m, responding to students and all this stuff, like no clear boundaries. I come from an advertising marketing background where sort of the culture is no boundaries. Like you get a little, gold pin every time you work a 18-hour shift. And, so, I mean, culturally, I'm sort of from an environment where, you get sort of rewarded for killing yourself. And as somebody who I guess I would call myself sort of a remote work advocate, or at least somebody in this field, I felt pretty prepared when things went remote. I was like, okay, we've already got the software, we've already got the technology, we've already got all this stuff, all our kids had a computer, everything was set up. But when it came down to boundaries, even though we did some things right, like for example, we kept our children on a bell schedule. So they had the same bell schedule at home that they did at school. So basically they got up at the same time, they did classes when they did classes at school, and that helped out a lot. But the problem was the kids would get done early, because they were able to rock through their work. There was no breaks, there was no, recess, there was none of this stuff. So they just fired through school, done by noon or 1 o'clock. And then me and my wife would proceed to work until 8 or 9 o'clock at night. And for no apparent reason, I mean, just, we just didn't stop. And here I am going around telling everybody, yes, I'm the expert. I'm the guy. I know all this stuff. And nonetheless, I could not bring myself to stop. So I think it is critical to have that discussion about boundaries.
Oh yeah, I mean, I myself am struggling with it too. I love my work, and I love I love the people that I connect with every day, and so I could just keep going. And what I did for myself is, I've experimented with tons of productivity things, but the thing that seems to work for me for some reason, things, for example, so one thing that's illogical is I use a paper planner instead of an app, for example. I don't know why, it just works for me, so I go with it. And so the schedule that I set for myself is every week on Mondays, I sit down and I say, okay, what does my schedule look like? And I block out my hours. Like, these are the hours that I'm going to work. And if it turns out that I can't work within those hours, like I'm too tired, I lose that time. So I don't get to make it up during another block. And then when that block is over, I don't get to work anymore. So when the block's over, I have like free time at that point. And for some reason, that switching, that hard start and stop that I've set ahead of time for myself, for some reason it works. And my brain's like, nope, you're not allowed to work right now. So I get to just turn off and do, hobby stuff. And that has saved me. The other thing that saved me is taking regular stretch breaks during the day. And I didn't realize how important this was. It sounds so simple and so easy, and it is, but I wasn't doing it. Like, I was just powering through 4 or 5 hour work sessions. That worked great when I was in my 20s and 30s, but now that I'm in my 40s, it kind of takes a toll. And I went to a doctor for my shoulders and neck because I was really having some stress problems there. And he goes, well, first of all, you're working too many hours. And in the Netherlands, it's not like the US. Like, 40 hours is the max. That is like the max that you're supposed to work. Whereas in the US, that's the min, right? And then he said, and you need to take more breaks. And he made the analogy, he said, listen, if you're climbing a mountain, you also on the way up the mountain have to sit down and eat an apple, take a rest before you can keep going. He said, the same thing holds true for your brain. You, every once in a while, every hour or two, you actually have to physically take a break. And he goes, and you're not allowed to read Twitter. Like, going from one screen to another is not a break. He says, you actually have to take a break, and like, no podcast, no Twitter, no screens. And I was like, oh my God, what am I going to do? But it's actually been surprisingly effective, just laying in the backyard for 5 or 10 minutes and then going back to it, or going a walk around the block and then getting back to it. Surprisingly effective. So there's a lot of simple things that we can do in terms of boundaries, but it's hard to implement them. It's just really hard to implement them. So what I tell people is, find what works for you. Whatever that is. There's no right or wrong in this department. It's whatever works for you, whether it's logical or rational, it doesn't matter. I'm carrying this stupid book around with me, this full focus planner, which I love. It's not rational or logical, but it works. So do that.
No, I use a paper planner also, and maybe it's just showing my age, because I think you and I are sort of contemporary in age, and so that's been the route for me. And honestly, I've always joked that I'm the worst about to-do lists. I'm not really good about it. Although I find when I use them, I actually get more done. So I should be better about it, but I don't. But what I think is sort of refreshing or interesting about your suggestions there is that sort of both of them are kind of analog, right? They're both a little offline. And I think there's probably something to that, little just giving your brain a moment from the blue lights and the screens and all these things and the notification bars and all these things that are going on all the time. Because I think, we're kind of programmed. I mean, we're using these, couple million-year-old brains. And we're working through, stuff that like clearly we could have never been programmed for, right? So we're flexing our brain and we're really stretching it out to do amazing things. But I mean, we can't be wired to work on like that, like that for, 24 hours a day. I mean, we've got to take some breaks. And so I myself have found, me, I guess, almost craving. I'm not really doing enough to work towards satiating these cravings, but I do find myself pushing more for things that are a little more offline, getting a little away from the computer, leaving my phone at home for the weekend or whatever. Like we just went out of town for the weekend. I just left my computer and my phone and everything back in Utah. And I physically couldn't check my email. I physically couldn't answer anything. I couldn't do any of that stuff. And for me, it was just a couple of days, but man, what a break. And so I think it's really important to sort of get that downtime. And even if it can't be for the whole weekend or whatever, I think, like you said, just getting up, maybe a little physical activity. I think especially for folks like you and I, who spend a lot of time in front of the computer, basically my whole career is sitting in front of a machine. It's highly critical that I get out and do something physical every now and then. Otherwise, I get to these evenings where I just start feeling drained. I start getting tired. I get a little chippy or edgy and kind of emotional or whatever. And, I think it's really critical that we build in that time for ourselves.
Yeah, I took a productivity class on Udemy earlier this week because I was actually struggling and somebody recommended. I thought, it's only a couple hours, I could fit this in. But he was saying that there's all these different types of time that we need to schedule for ourselves. And I thought that was really good. He said, there's time to achieve goals, there's time to rest, there's time to take care of your relationships, and then there's time for creativity. And I thought, there's a couple of time block, like I'm blocking out time for goals all the time and rest. Like I'm like goals and rest, but I don't often block out time for my relationships or for creativity. And so it was just kind of eye-opening that there's a lot more even that I can do. I've been working remotely just like you for almost 20 years now, and I'm still learning stuff about myself and productivity as I go, which is why I think that companies and the focus on work-life balance right now is so critical, because I think as everybody went remote, everybody realized like, oh my gosh, we can't stop. Like we're just continuing. And I think it was a surprise for many people.
Yeah. Well, and that's been sort of one of our observations that's occurred during COVID and sort of this rushed work from home. And again, it goes back to this idea of intention. People who are, now working from home, whether or not they like it or wanted to, I'm finding, at least from a mental health perspective, it seems like many people who sort of haven't properly set their intention to be working remotely, and they're sort of, there against their will, they've got a foot back in the office, all that sort of stuff. Now they're starting to get blindsided by the things that are really common in remote work, isolation, stress, anxiety, all these sorts of things that are really common in the remote work world. And I think if you're prepared for remote work, if you're there on purpose, then when those things roll in, you go, okay, I read an article about this, or I kind of know what to do with it, right? You're a little bit fortified mentally for it. But I think for these other people who just flat out don't want it and they're not thinking about it, there's this, all of a sudden they're feeling these emotions or these vibes, and they don't know what to do with them. They're a little bit out of context. And so in terms of mental health, I think it's important, like you're saying, the employers start to recognize this and pay a little bit more attention to this work-life balance. And it's funny because we're saying work-life balance, and for years I've always thought that was sort of one of those little buzzy, kitschy things that we say, and when we say work-life balance, we mean we're going to give you treats at work so you'll stay there longer, but you can kind of balance out a little bit, And so, but I think work-life balance now, for as cliche as it sounds or whatever, I think it really is becoming sort of the new normal. And you're not seeing any shortage of articles or managerial direction that's, everything is mental health focused nowadays, or there's a significant push for it anyway.
Yeah. And I think it's important because we're going to burn ourselves out rather quickly. Also we all went remote overnight, not the recommended method, I would say. If I go back and listen to some talks a few years ago that I gave, and I recommend people like do an afternoon a week or one day a week and just see how it goes. So this whole like everybody go remote overnight, that's totally not the way. But the added stress of one, having a killer virus out there is huge, and having your family at home all the time. That's not normal remote working. Before COVID, I'm one of the rare people. I don't have children, and I've got a big house, and and an office. So, but I have a luxurious setup at home. And when I look into the windows of my neighbors, I can see that they're sitting at their kitchen tables, like uncomfortable chairs. They don't have proper setups. Like I've got a stand desk and multiple monitors, the best headset, awesome speakers. Like I'm totally set up for it and I'm stressed. I cannot imagine what it must be like to be working with a family on your kitchen table without the proper tools.
Well, yeah, I mean, during this time, I've been thinking a lot, especially in my marketing company or my design agency, we have a small Spanish team. And for those guys, especially when lockdown was sort of at its height and they're stuck in their tiny little flats in a country that's really built for being outside. They're stuck in these little flats with no exterior space, no anything. And so to your idea of comfort, I mean, like, yeah, I mean, I've got a private office, I've got, a comfy chair and a desk and all this stuff, and I'm ready to go. But those guys, they're not equipped for that at all. And so many of them are, really struggling. And now, thank goodness, they've got a little bit of freedom. They can get out of the house, but it's still, the struggle is real for sure. You mentioned earlier, one of the things that you were talking about or had discovered in this productivity seminar was this stuff about, developing relationships, things like that. And it brings me to this idea or this article that I was reading. It was called 3 Career Questions to Ask Yourself During the New Normal. And it wasn't specific to remote work, but I sort of am able to think of it in the frame of remote work, given that everybody's working from home right now. So I think it makes sense. But the 3 questions that she asked were: 1, which relationships have become stronger? 2, how has this experience made you more resilient? And 3, what will you make time for in terms of reevaluating your life? And so I think it's interesting because we've kind of landed on a couple of those topics just as we've been sitting here without really, focusing the conversation in that way. But I think, it's a little bit of a mindset shift, but I think if you stop and think about it, you could probably check each of those boxes and look at the relationships we've made and the things that we've had to do. And I think you could actually start looking for some silver linings here during this, post-COVID time. And so I wonder if you talk a little bit about that, sort of, I guess, evaluating relationships, being able to sort of set your mind in such a way that you can actually look for the positives, and maybe if in your own experience or in the experience of people who you interact with, if you can talk about resilience, just the way that people are actually finding they're maybe more capable than they thought they were.
Well, I'll start with resilience in terms of, there were a lot of naysayers that were 100% against remote work when COVID began. And when they were forced to do it, actually, it turned out that they found it was possible. They may not have liked it, but they found that it was possible. So I think one of the things about resilience is, I think a lot of people saw the benefit of actually being able to work remote. And I think a lot of people had it on their roadmap for like, oh, way down the line, I'd like to go remote and we're going to do it eventually. And this just sort of brought it to the forefront, But in terms of companies and resilience, I've always said it is in every company's best interest, whether you are going to allow for remotes or not, to have the processes and systems in place to be able to work remotely in case something happened. Now, I never imagined a global pandemic. That's a bit of a dramatic example, of course. But, I used like sick children at home, bad weather, transportation strikes, all the common things that would keep people from home. But when companies have those systems and processes set up and can do and work in this hybrid way where some people are in the office, some people are remote, everybody's working where they're most productive, those companies will outperform the companies that cannot do this just because by nature of it, right? So if you have those systems in place, your company will only be stronger for it. And a global pandemic it's kind of a random one and an extreme one, but okay, here we are. But I think a lot of people are now seeing the value of being remote first because it gives your company superpowers. If work doesn't have to stop because Mary's staying home because her kids are sick, or that meeting doesn't have to be rescheduled because somebody's waiting for the plumber, then business will just thrive. So I think that there's a resilience question there that I think a lot of people are experiencing.
Yeah, no, I really like that. And I'm even thinking as you're talking here about sort of the resilience of the individual and how, the same kind of preparation, whether it's remote work or anything, right? I mean, maybe it's emergency meal planning or, having an escape route from your house in case of fire, right? I mean, pre-planning whatever you've got, is obviously going to make you more capable of rolling with the punches a little bit. And so if, in the case of the work from home folks, had your employers been taking care of you in that respect, had they been giving you opportunity to try working from home, had they been building in processes and infrastructure to make that happen, now when this happened, whether you're having your own personal COVID or whether you're experiencing this global pandemic, you would have been infinitely more prepared to handle it. And so I think that that's really good advice, especially going forward and now understanding just how bad things can be. I think it's probably even more important that employers start to look at how they can package this into their training and into the work they're doing.
Well, and I would say, in fact, companies, even to go even further, I would say companies have a moral imperative to be able to implement this so that people can keep themselves safe. Everybody has a different level of what is safe to them. I mean, my husband, I am happy to get groceries delivered. Like, I have my groceries delivered all, like I'll just have it. But for him, the quality of the produce of the delivery, it's not as good as what he likes. So he'll go to the grocery store. I don't see the need to go to the grocery store, right? We have different levels of sort of safety precautions. And I think that employers need to recognize that their employees are also going to have different levels of what feels safe to them. So even if lockdowns do end, I think there's a moral imperative for companies to make it possible so that people can keep themselves safe.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great observation because it's true. I mean, a lot of times when we're building a business or whatever, we might think about sort of that lowest common denominator. We might be sort of putting together everything for a one size fits all for one, sort of use case or for an individual. And it, obviously becomes quite a bit more difficult to try and manage the needs of everybody. But I think it can be done through good policy and through flexible practices. And like you said, through choice. And I think that allowing that choice or giving people the freedom to make it, especially, I mean, you make a good point that when, let's say lockdowns ended today, I mean, you're still going to have a subset of individuals who are not ready to come back to work.
Absolutely.
They're afraid, or maybe they live with an elder parent or have somebody who's immunocompromised in their house or something, and they just can't roll the dice on it. And so offering that flexibility not only, I guess endears you as an employer, you're giving these people the freedom to be able to protect themselves and do what they see as correct. But you're also, not hindering work. You're allowing work to go on. You can keep these people employed instead of, other situations where maybe they've had to let people go because they simply couldn't do it. And so I think that idea of a moral imperative, I think, is really a great idea.
Well, I say that, and I'd like to put a caveat on that because I do recognize that, okay, it's very easy to say, like, you have a moral imperative to make sure that you can set it up. However, it does require, that moral imperative requires kind of a significant investment in infrastructure in order to make that work well. Because we're now going into a situation, when everybody's remote, it's one situation. But when you have a hybrid situation, some people are at the office and some people are remote, that's a different situation. And very few companies are set up to be able to handle that really, really well, right? Like, conference rooms need to be set up with good equipment that actually you can push a button and people can phone in and you can see the remote participants. There's all kinds of things that companies will need to do in order to make that scenario work. So yes, there's a moral imperative, and I do recognize that there's a financial component to this. However, your company's on the line, right? Like, now is the time to invest to make sure that people at home have an ergonomic setup, or that they've got the security protocols they need to be able to access the information that they need, or that they can dial into the meeting and be present, and that they don't get left behind with the people that are in the office. So it's easy to say, like, yeah, I've got this high horse, but I do recognize that there's a significant investment there.
Well, and I think that's fair, but I also think that just in terms of sort of mindset, I mean, there are a lot of people that throw around this idea of being people first nowadays and don't necessarily know what that means. It sounds great. And obviously you want to say that to just about everybody. But I think one of these things is, and maybe moral imperative sounds a little bit dramatic or a little bit big. But ultimately, if you are trying to lead a people first organization and you do actually care about the people that work there, maybe it's not a moral imperative, but nonetheless, you should be driven by what you can do to make their lives better for these people and sort of accommodate for what, can be done. And I think that's totally in line with sort of where management practices are headed nowadays anyway. I mean, obviously 15, 20 years ago, maybe it was less critical, but, it's come up several times in this conversation, but I mean, just the amount of attention that employers are paying to issues of mental health, for example, and sort of these, I don't know, kind of intangibles, right? It was one thing if your mental health issue was, I don't know, schizophrenia and you physically couldn't come to the office or something. But but now we're talking about like subtle things, like psychological safety, things like this that are no less important, but, kind of hard to really wrap your head around. It's how do I make sure that somebody feels psychologically safe? And I think so much of it goes back to this idea of intention and empathy and things like this, where really you're just setting forth, from this moral imperative to take care of your people. And I think if you do that, you're, certain to not only raise better and more loyal employees and, have a happier and healthier workforce, but I think you'll ultimately see all that net out in, productivity gains or whatever at the office.
Oh, sure. And to be fair, also the cost of equipment has come down so much. It's not like you need these super fancy setups anymore, right? Like a good monitor, a good webcam, a good headset, like, it's not so much money. And I think the productivity that what you get back in return more than pays for it.
Yeah.
It's just that it's different. It's just that it's different. I keep saying to people, remote is different than in person. It's not better or worse. It's different. It's a different medium. And I make the analogy to television and radio, right? They're also different mediums, but you produce content for those mediums differently. It's the same with remote and in person. They're just different mediums, but you have to think of it as different. You have to shift your mindset to, it's this medium. I need to produce content for this now.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great observation because it's true. I think, especially when we start talking about remote work as a choice, I've heard a lot of people try and just make the argument that remote work should just be work, right? This is just work. And so, but I do think it is important that even if it is just work, and we do try and sort of not necessarily delineate the two, I think it's still really important that you do recognize your medium. It's just like anything. I mean, whether it comes down to writing emails or sending texts or whatever, I mean, there's sort of protocol. Right. I mean, if you're using a bunch of slang and, you're writing incoherently and you're not capitalizing and putting periods in your email, that's as ineffective as an in-person meeting where, maybe, I don't know, you got two people in the room not speaking the same language or something.
Right.
Right. I mean, so it is, it's the same, but different, so I think that's a good way to look at it. I wanted to circle back to this idea of relationships then. So one of the things that's come up sort of, or an observation I've made, I guess, is, and I guess it's also as it pertains to this idea of what will you make time for, this idea of reevaluating your life. I think so many people, despite COVID or maybe because of COVID, have had an opportunity to sort of reset and sort of think about what's important, maybe understand priorities a little bit differently. And one of the things that I keep kind of just throwing away as this little cliche or this little thought is that, basically now, like I said, I had joked about my new coworkers being the problem. But what's funny is that most people work their whole lives to retire for the opportunity to spend this much time with their kids, or with their spouse or their whomever. And so I think, it is a good opportunity in that respect. And I think, so if someone was to ask me, how have my relationships gotten better? Obviously, because I'm sitting here on Zoom all day, I'm meeting a lot of people. I'm, having an opportunity to network and build new relationships with new folks, but I'm also having a lot of offline relationships that have grown and improved too. Just even, in the relationship with my own kids, for example, they used to be at school all day and I used to be at work all day, and we'd sometimes meet in the middle and eventually be home. But those relationships have all grown just by virtue of me being in the next room. And so I think that that it's really important to maybe sort of look at those relationships and try and weigh out, the work stuff from the social stuff, because I think there's obviously a lot of improvement or a lot of gains that have been made over this time.
Well, yeah, it also would help in the social isolation category that many remote workers feel. And one thing that always surprised me, I'm very different than most people in this respect, in that I don't have the loneliness or alone isolation problem. Like, you could leave me alone in a home office for years without anybody and I might be okay. So I'm a different beast in that respect. I mean, I do love the relationships that I have, but for me, it actually takes active effort to go out and maintain my relationships. And I'm going to admit something that's really, it's going to sound autistic, but this is what works for me. Is I actually have a stack of note cards. They're not within reach, or I'd show you. I have a stack of note cards, and on my note cards is a list of, every note card has a name of a good friend that I really value and want to keep in touch with. And every day I draw a card, and the idea is I have to make some sort of contact with the person on that card. And that's my way of just and it's random. So I just pull a card at random, and maybe Alfred gets 2 in 1 week, like I get contact him twice. But it's my way of ensuring that I maintain the relationships that I value a lot, is that I just, make sure I do that. But the other thing is that I've been surprised by how much social activity most people get from going to work. That is many people's main social circle is their colleagues at work. And I think that COVID is maybe giving people an opportunity to broaden that social. So like maybe you're meeting your neighbors a little bit more now for the first time. I know that our neighborhood is really banded together. Like we've all been eating lunch outside. Everybody's working at home, so we all eat lunch outside. So we're just seeing each other every day in our yards. And from that, and like the kids are going back and forth, so we're meeting all the kids and stuff. So, I think that people are realizing that, in fact, you have to be proactive about maintaining and finding new social connections when those connections are not your colleagues. So maybe my autistic note card thing is a bit weird and extreme, but I think that, it kind of gives an example that you do have to actually go out and proactively find people to be with, especially during COVID, if your colleagues are your main source.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. And I think that, even as it pertains to just standard remote work, there's always these discussions. You always see these things, especially, more so now, but there's always these online happy hours or, Zoom coffee breaks or whatever, where people are trying to, I guess, sort of bridge this social gap, via remote. And I keep going back and forth on the idea of sort of what is the role of the employer versus at what point should we take a little personal responsibility when it comes to our social isolation. Obviously, if you're in an office environment, you'll build camaraderie with the people around you and that sort of thing. And so it's sort of maybe a byproduct of just that nature, that type of work. When you work remotely, obviously you're much more probably adept at dealing with, building relationship by way of video call or phone call or email or whatever. And so maybe like you said, you just don't necessarily have the need, this emotional need to be engaged in something social at every living moment. I love the way you're doing it, again, using sort of an analog platform to find a way to stay in touch. And, I think that's, I mean, honestly, I think that's kind of a unique or an interesting way of doing it because, I know even with my own friends, the only time I'll think to stop and connect with somebody is if a random thought occurs, or if, I see somebody pop up in the news or someplace like that, then I go, oh, okay, well, I should say hi. But, in terms of maintaining relationships, building better relationships and all that stuff, the key word or the thing that you've sort of landed on is this idea of effort. And again, by extension, intention, this idea that I beat that word into the ground, but so much of it has to do with that intention and going out and really building these relationships and being purposeful in what we're doing with people. And I think, especially for entrepreneurs, people who are working remotely, but running their own business, like you and I, for example, getting out there and making those relationships happen is critical. And obviously during, COVID, it's been a little tougher. I know that most of my, in-person networking events have dried up, for example. So I'm not really out meeting people, locally anymore. And, and that's a struggle for our business because we do a lot of business by handshake. We've got to get out and meet people. And but I do think it is important to look at these different things and maybe understand, I guess, the responsibility of your employer in your social interactions, and I think sort of being empowered to go out and maybe meet your friends or like you said, maybe the neighbors or somebody, I think is going to be a big component of sort of maintaining our mental health.
Yeah, when I first moved to San Francisco 20 something years ago, and I first lived, I didn't know anybody. And what I did is I ended up going to this, it's going to sound funny being 45 now, but anyway, I was a total goth kid. So what I ended up doing is we used to go to this goth club every week and then a couple of other places, like a yoga place. So I went to yoga and I went to this goth club every week. And that's where, because I was new in town, I knew nobody. That's where I started meeting people. So in my head, what burned in my head was, if you want to meet people in an environment where you know nobody, you start to go to a place regularly. And inevitably, you will see somebody regularly there who you will end up, meeting, and they'll introduce you. So that was sort of my way of like starting and then branching out. So I would say to people, find something that you're interested in. And during COVID, it's extra hard. I mean, the social isolation during COVID, it is brutal, right? Because we're not allowed to even be near people at the moment. But there are so many creative ways to reach out to people right now. I would say find something that you're interested in, and then reach out and try to find a local group where maybe you can meet online and then eventually meet in person. But tap into an external network besides your colleagues just for your own sanity, I would say.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. So we're starting to get towards the end of this thing. I wanted to talk maybe a little bit more tactical about maybe how remote work will be used going forward then. So I think we've acknowledged that, COVID-19 probably more of a bust than a boon for remote work, just in respect to the fact that it's not the way we'd have had it, I think. I mean, obviously we'd have transitioned into remote a little smoother if we'd had our druthers. But, how are you seeing that we'll actually be leveraging this, especially when some section of our employee workforce or whatever, if we're not already remote first anyway, is probably got that 1 foot back in the office. They're thinking about going work. How do you see, at least from the manager's perspective, how do you keep sort of, I guess, now this hybrid environment going?
Yeah, so one, with the hybrid environment, I say get your infrastructure set up to accommodate hybrid working, right? Like have enough conference rooms and places where people can brainstorm and work together on virtual whiteboards, or at least have places to meet. So get your infrastructure set up so that people can easily connect. And I like to make the analogy to Star Trek. Like you want to have that, you want it to be push to talk, not like, hey, can you meet next week at 2:00? You want to be able to like push a button, talk to the person you need to talk to, and then get back to your work. So set up infrastructure. And then the other thing that people need to get really good at is asynchronous communication. One of the things that happened when COVID hit is everybody went online, and we just had online meetings all day long. And so, this whole Zoom fatigue thing, it's a real thing. And so what I tell people is, in order to preserve your sanity and to actually find time for deep work, you've got to get really good at asynchronous communication. So I tell companies you need to decrease the number of meetings that you need and improve the quality of the meetings that you have. So going asynchronous, one, it allows people to have more time because you're doing things asynchronously. You don't need to meet up and sync so much together. The other thing that it does is, I lost my train of thought. So you get more time, better decision-making potentially within the company, because instead of making decisions in this time box, like we're gonna do this now, you're actually giving people more time to think about the decisions that they need to make. So those are kind of the big things that I see that companies immediately need to start working on, is get the infrastructure in place, decrease the number of meetings that you need, and improve the ones that you have. And when I say improve, it's not just infrastructure, it's also learn how to facilitate online meetings, learn how to host and facilitate online meetings well. It's not the same as in person. There's more preparation involved, and it's a different way of running the show to keep people engaged and sort of contributing. There's a lot of work that can be done there.
Yeah, no, and I think it's interesting also that I think people will find that with relatively little effort, like especially if you've put very little into this prior to COVID, with relatively little work and relatively little new learning, you can actually impact things in a pretty dramatic way. I mean, just by being better about the way you structure a meeting, for example, or making sure that you've got the right kinds of people in the meeting, or the people who should be there are there and those who shouldn't be aren't. Just by sort of setting, I guess, again, boundaries, back to our early discussion, I think you can make a lot of impact in relatively little time. And so it's not this giant mountain that you need to overcome in one day. It's, I think, just, being intentional and making little improvements as you go. I mean, maybe one of the blessings of COVID, maybe the pressure's off a little bit to try and solve momentous things overnight. Like, we'll give you a little time. Everybody can be a little more patient now because we're all sort of struggling together. Right. So I think that that's something, to consider. So here in closing, let's just talk a little bit about Collaboration Superpowers, what you guys are doing now during COVID, how you are, adapting to all this, because I know that you guys do a lot of workshops and things like that. I presume most of those are being done online at this point. But
yeah,
can we talk
100% now.
Yeah, can we talk a little bit about what you're doing at Collaboration Superpowers and how people might get in touch with you or learn more about the work, the service that you're doing?
Yeah, so what we offer right now, the Work Together Anywhere workshop is the bread and butter really of the company, and that one basically is set out to give people a roadmap for designing how they can collaborate better with their teams. So it's that one, it's a 6-hour workshop, not all at once, and done in 90-minute chunks with breaks, and so it was very sane. So there's that one. We also have another one on asynchronous communication, how to do that well, like what are the basics, what do you need to know about that? We have another one on hybrid collaboration that just came out. And then there's a remote meetings masterclass. So there's all these kind of workshops. Above that, there's also the book. I'm very excited about the book. So I self-published the book a couple of years ago. And then when COVID hit, Wiley called and said, hey, we'd like to publish your book for you. So that's exciting. So the book is out and I'm super excited. It's now out in Japanese, like it's been translated into Japanese. So one thing about the Japanese book is it's read the other direction. So you can see this one is in one direction, this one's in the other direction. So they read it, I'm gonna say back to front because I'm used to, but I don't know what the right terms are. It's back to front and from top to bottom. It's like so anyway, I still learned something new. So there's all kinds of resources, and it's not just me giving workshops. In fact, I'm only giving one per month at this point. I have 51 facilitators giving workshops all over the world in all kinds of different languages. It's been translated into Spanish, Portuguese, Japanese, Italian, and German. So I'm honored actually to see the workshop go so far into the world and to see how it's helping people. Yeah, that's basically what we do. The other thing that we have at Collaboration Superpowers is the podcast, of course, which I was honored to have you again as a guest on that podcast. And what we're trying to do there is it's not a podcast about raw remote is great. It's a podcast about what have you struggled with and what did you do to overcome that challenge? Because if you're a remote pro, it's still not easy. Even if you've been doing this for 20 years, it's still not easy. Just like, working in an office, you're always going to need to align and communicate well. And, it's kind of an ongoing thing that people need to work on. Just like productivity, it changes over time. What was productive for you 10 years ago is not the same as what's productive for you now. So there's sort of an evolution of that. Yeah, I'm excited to see how much the workshop has grown.
Yeah, no, that's incredible. Well, and it's funny that you mentioned that last bit there, because it's something I've been talking a lot about lately, which is this sort of embracing fluidity and controlling what we can control, especially in times of COVID and things like that. I think so much of our anxiety comes from the unknown, not being sure what's coming around the corner. And I think the more we can control the things we can control, the better off we're going to be. So I think that's a great point. So,
yeah, in fact, I just wanted to say, I saw on my, I used Calm, the meditation app to in the mornings. And this morning's quote was, if you want real control, drop the illusion of control and just let life live you. It does anyway. And I was like, oh, that was good.
Yeah, deep.
I can control. Yeah. Well, oh man, that was a good one. No, but I can control certain things, and then the rest of it, like COVID, I cannot control. And so I need to just let that go. So what I always say is take care of yourself and those immediately around you that you can offer help to. Like Mr. Rogers, right? Like find the helpers and be a helper. And then we have to just let go of all the other things that we can't do anything about.
Yeah,
I
think that makes sense. Sometimes we just kind of have to stand there and let things happen and, do the best we can. Even so much of our discussions lately have circled around just sort of these core fundamental things, communication, relationships, empathy, these sorts of things, because as the world is spinning around you chaotically out of control, if you can sort of plant your feet in concrete and stand there in the middle, you can let everything go nuts around you, yet meanwhile, your world doesn't have to change all that much. This fundamental stuff is still true and will always be true. So I think that's great. Well, Lisette, thanks so much for doing this. I'm really grateful to have had you. Collaborationsuperpowers.com is the website. And thanks so much. Really, really thrilled to have this conversation with you.
Thank you, Ryan. It's been great to be here.
And thanks to everybody who's tuned in this week, every week, and continues to support us over at Team Made Apart and everywhere else we are. So until next time, we'll see you then.